Hello everyone. I hope you all are doing great. A warm welcome to the Expert Edge Masterclass proudly brought to you by Shine.com. We are thrilled to have you with us today for an insightful session on Vue.js, the beginner's guide to a progressive JavaScript framework. Vue.js is known for its progressive architecture, reactive data handling, and seamless component based development, making it a preferred choice for building dynamic user interface, modern web application, and single page applications. With ongoing advancement in performance optimization, state management, and TypeScript support, Vue.js continues to empower developers by offering a lightweight yet powerful framework that integrate effortlessly with both small scale projects and large enterprise applications. In an era where speed, scalability, and user experience define the success of web application, learning Vue.js is a game changer for developer aiming to build fast, maintainable, and high performing application with ease. Before we begin, let me quickly introduce myself. I am Preeti, your host for the session. And now it's my pleasure to introduce someone with deep expertise in software development and training, Mr. Parameswaran Iyer. Parameswaran is a software developer with 8 years of experience and a strong interest in backend programming. Passionate about learning and sharing knowledge, he has been training Android and Java at a reputed institute in Mumbai. A team player and a motivator, he collaborates with like-minded professionals and takes on leadership role. This is your chance to learn from an industry expert, so stay engaged, ask questions, and take notes. The insights you gain today will help you build a strong foundation in Vue.js and accelerate your journey as a JavaScript developer. Without further delay, let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Parameswaran Iyer. Over to you.
Hi guys, thank you Preeti a lot for this introduction. So what I'll be going on today is basically introducing you to Vue.js, what Vue.js is, and I'll be basically taking on the role of letting you know about the concepts of Vue.js and just create few projects. There's one of the projects which I like to try here and basically have fun, right? So what I would want is basically whenever you are actually having a look at whatever I am doing and explaining, if you have some doubts, feel free to ping us so that we can have this session as interactive as possible. Uh, what I'll do is jump right on and I'll share my screen. Just give me a second. I'll bring this tab here. Yeah. So, firstly, as Priti said, Vue.js is basically a JavaScript framework. Uh, you might have heard of React, you might have heard of Angular, which are other JavaScript frameworks and which are very well known. Vue is basically an alternative for these frameworks, right? The main reason why Vue came into picture. So before actually jumping on to actually understanding what the framework is and everything, I it would be better for us to actually have a bit of background of why this framework even came to picture, right? So now, previously, Angular is still used a lot in the industry, and one of the main things of Angular is a framework which has everything built into it. It has all kinds of tools available inside the framework itself, and basically it allows us to do any kind of additional things in using the plugins that are available in the framework. On the flip side, we have React, which is by Facebook, Meta right now. And what React does is basically gives us the ability to create web apps or web components and stick to just UI as essentially. React was mainly intended to be just for UI. And what React does is basically it gives us a plugin architecture wherein apart from, is my screen visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
It's visible, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So apart from the UI part, React basically encourages you to add anything as external plugins. Uh, like for example, even the router in case of React is a third-party plugin which is maintained by community, and basically we add those plugins and we achieve the result that we want. Vue is somewhere in between what React follows and what Angular follows. What Vue does is Vue has a structure. Vue also has a plugin architecture. What Vue encourages you to do is whenever you want a feature, you add a plugin, but those plugins are actually maintained by the Vue team itself. So Vue essentially the major plugins are actually maintained by the official team. For example, the Vue router is one of the main plugins which are maintained by the official team themselves. Apart from that, whenever you have third-party plugins, you are free to actually install them. So this is one of the main balance that Vue actually follows between React and Angular. One of the main reasons why Vue has gained popularity a lot is because just like React, it is actually pretty easy to get started with Vue, and the learning curve is pretty normal. At the same time, just like Angular and quite opposite to what React does, Vue encourages you to split the code in three separate parts, which is the UI, the actual markup, the HTML part maybe, the script in the script tag, as well as the styling in the styling part. So unlike React, where usually all the scripts, styling, and everything is merged inside the JSX file itself, or TSX if you are using TypeScript, Vue basically encourages you to split them. But at the same time, they are maintained in the single file itself, unlike Angular, where you have three different files. So what I'll do now is I'll actually quickly create a project in Vue, and I'll explain you how the project structure is. And based on that, maybe we can have first round of doubts that maybe you have till then, and then we can move forward, right? Uh, so overall, in the next 2 hours, I'll actually be referring to the Vue docs a lot. The main reason to do that is Vue docs is actually a really good place to get started with learning how to get about it, anything with Vue. And it is a really beginner friendly docs. Now, whenever you are actually starting out learning a new tech, getting resources in net is obviously a plus point, but learning to actually read the docs in itself is actually a very good deal. And when the docs are actually good, it actually enhances the overall developer experience a lot. Vue is one of the projects which has really good documentation. So I'll actually encourage you guys to maybe in fact open this same Vue docs simultaneously so that you can also have a look, right? You can just go to vuejs.org and you will be able to access this. Right? Now, to first get started with Vue, obviously you require Node.js installed. The main reason for that is even though Vue is going to run in front end, Vue in itself has its own syntax, which requires compiling into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript so that eventually the app can be built. And for that, it uses something called as wheat or white, however you want to pronounce it. Now, till Vue 2, now this version, the version that we are actually doing right now is Vue 3. Till Vue 2, Webpack was one of the bundlers which was used for bundling. Webpack is a very popular bundler that was used primarily uh, but it was actually not made for front end. It was actually made for back end. But because it supported plugins, it was used for front end quite a lot also. Uh, with Vue 3, the Vue official Vue team actually created their own bundler, which they open sourced it later on. So even React projects actually support Vue now. Uh, and they encourage to use Vue instead of Webpack. So Vue is basically a bundler which is specifically made for front end, and because of which it is really fast at what it does. So since you have to run it, you need require Node in during the development phase of a Vue application. Once you have actually developed it and you build it as a single page application, you actually don't require Node. You can simply deploy this entire thing in a static website, in a static hosting page, just like Firebase or some other static hosting. It can actually work with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript simply. You don't require Node server there. Right? So the package manager of my choice is going to be Yarn. You can use npm or pnpm of your choice. That doesn't change anything, right? So what I'm doing is I'm actually just simply creating a small project. Right now, it is basically going to be create. So when I run this, I'll just quickly zoom this a bit. Yeah. So when I run this, it is actually going to ask me a few questions, which is basically the initializer for the Vue project. It basically goes on asking what plugins do you want by default and what plugins you are okay to not have. Obviously, you can add whatever plugin, even though you choose not to do it when creating the project. You can add this plugins whenever you want. It does not change anything, right? Sorry. So, while this is actually building, what the project that we'll do in this particular next 2 hours is a very simple expense manager wherein we can add our expenses, we can update it, right? This entire thing will basically allow you to see how we can handle forms, how we can handle conditional rendering as well as list rendering in Vue. Uh, so that is the basic use case that I have selected for this. Obviously, when you are doing it, I would encourage you to take as many use cases as possible and just do projects hands-on. That is the best way to learn any tech for it, for that, right? Meanwhile, I think we can just quickly take some out. Um, Karthik is asking, as a beginner in JavaScript, is it okay to be in this session? Yeah, definitely, no issues. So whatever I'm taking right now is pretty beginner friendly, so it doesn't change anything. You don't need to know any prerequisites right now. Obviously, if you know prerequisites, that would be great. Definitely. Is it true that Vue can't be used for big size projects? No, not true actually, because I have been using it for a lot of big projects. For some reason, Vue, yeah, it's failing. So yeah, so default project basically tasks. Right now, the project name is going to be expense manager. Do I want to add TypeScript? Primarily, right now, it's no. When you are actually creating a production project, it is better if you use TypeScript, definitely. JSX Vue actually has JSX support, just like so basically just like React, where you write everything inside a function in JavaScript, and you basically write everything inside JavaScript. Vue actually has the ability to do that, do the same thing. Again, it's not necessary that you do it. There is a feature, there is an option for you. Most of the time, you won't end up using it, definitely. Do I want to add router right now? No, I don't want a router right now. Pinia is basically a state management system for Vue. Previously in Vue 2, it was Vue, something called as UX. In Vue 3, Pinia is introduced, which basically replaces Vuex. When you are actually creating production projects, you might end up using state management, but there are other alternatives to this. Mainly, there is something called as composables, and Vue actually enables the Vue 3 actually enables you to do it. So it is not per se mandatory to have a state management just to have small use cases. I'm not going to be doing any testing right now. So all of this is just no, no, no. So what I'll do is I'll open this in VS Code. Yeah. So the first thing that I'm going to do is basically just run yarn install, which will actually install all the dependencies which are present in package.json. Right now, as I said, you can use any installer, any package manager that you want, be it npm or be it pnpm, whatever. But when you are working in a project, always stick to single package manager. If you started out with yarn, use yarn throughout. At the same time, have your teammates use yarn. If you're starting out with npm, use npm, so that it does not create conflicts with when multiple people are working, because each package manager has different way in which it actually handles the package. For example, when I actually run yarn install, it will create a file called as yarn.log here. Whereas when you actually run npm install, it creates a package called as package-log.json. So every package manager has different way in which it handles packages, and hence don't mix packages that can create issues with versions, right? So once I run this yarn install, once this is done, I'm simply just going to first run the app so that we can actually see some kind of output, right? Now, by default, when you actually run Vue, when you create Vue, uh, it what it does is basically create something called as a single page application. Okay. When you're creating web applications, there are different types of renderings, like single page app. There is also something called as server side rendering, and there is also something called as static site generation. There are different types of rendering web applications. Single page apps are applications which basically, whenever you actually run the app, the entire app gets sent from where whatever server you have hosted, it actually gets sent from that server to the browser. And each time you are navigating, it is just simply changing the navigation, changing the UI based on whatever code you have written. It is not actually sending request back and forth. Obviously, it will send request back and forth for data and API calls that you have written. But all in all, majority chunk of the app is actually loaded beforehand. Now, this basically creates load time issues because single page apps can tend to be of higher size as compared to server-side rendering. So in server-side rendering, whenever you actually visit that app, visit that particular page, only one single page gets rendered, and the final HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is sent. No other pages are rendered by default. This is the crux of it. So by default, whenever you actually run Vue, you end up creating something called as a single page app. If you want to have server-side rendering and other abilities, there are frameworks of Vue which can handle that for you. Nuxt is one such framework, Nuxt. Nuxt. I'll just put that up in chat also. Auto-corrected. Nuxt. Not next. Nuxt. Yeah. Next is the framework of React. Nuxt is a framework of Vue. Nuxt basically does server-side rendering and all those sorts of things for Vue.js, and Next does it for React. Next is basically inspired from Nuxt, right? So right now we have the project, we have the dependencies installed, and we have a very base project here. What I'll do is I'll just simply uh, run the project. Yeah, dev, and this should just open the just build the app and give us the base outline that we have right now. Yeah. So this is what base, the default project of Vue looks like, right? Now when I actually show you the code, you will see that now one of the important files, all the important files are basically inside SRC and the index HTML, which is required, right? Let's start with index HTML first, right? Index HTML basically has the base markup of your project, which actually invokes the Vue app and brings the Vue app into picture. This file is one of the most important files. Anything that you actually write here will be visible in the UI also. Like for example, if I just go on and write here something. See, initially I was able to see just hello world and then the Vue app got loaded. As I said, index.html is the file where your Vue app actually gets loaded, right? So this is one of the ways wherein you can actually add CSS to your entire project. There are better ways to do it, definitely. This is just one of the ways, not the recommended, right? So what happens here is basically we have a division which has an ID of app, and we have a script tag which basically is bringing in the main.js file from the SRC folder. Now, if we see the main.js file, what the main.js file does is basically first line is it imports the CSS, not useful right now. We have something called as a create app function from the Vue library, right? And then we are importing the component app. Okay, I'll come to this, what app is. Now, the first thing that we are doing is basically creating a Vue app from this component and then mounting it to the division that we created, right? So whatever I'm writing inside this hash app is basically the ID app. So this ID has to match with this ID, right? So say suppose if I change this to view app, again, that has to, even this has to change. See, right now, if you see the output, it is simply just going to be blank, nothing, right? Uh, what I need to do is I need to change this so that the view app gets loaded. Now, when I do that, obviously, a lot of my styling gets affected because in the assets folder, you will actually see that a lot of styling is done with the ID app. So I'm just simply going to revert it back. But what you need to remember is this ID is what is going to actually be used to find the division where your app has to be loaded. So unless you know the ID, you cannot load it. By default, as you can see, all of this is configured with the Vue default template itself. So you don't need to do anything. But just in case if you have changed something in index.html, always remember, do not remove these two lines. If you remove these two lines, you are essentially removing the Vue app itself. Right? Is this fair enough? Is my screen visible?
It is visible.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Fine. So here what is happening is basically we are importing the app component and mounting it in this particular HTML. Now let's go look at the app component. Yeah. So what this app component is basically this is something called as a single file component. What happens is basically this app component is a view component which has its markup, its JavaScript logic, and maybe even its styling, right? So whatever you are actually seeing in the browser is what is actually being rendered in the app component. So if you see, this view logo is basically this part. This wrapper hello world is, let's see what is inside. You have successfully created a view project, which is basically this part. And we have a main tag, which is the welcome component, which is basically this part, right? So all of that is basically happening inside the app component, and we have bunch of styling here, and also we have something called as a script setup. What it is, I'll come to that, and we are importing two components which we are actually rendering here, right? So this is a base structure that Vue app comes with. Now, what you need to remember is all of these folder names, in fact, even file names are not necessarily needs to be the same. Instead of main.js, you can rename it to index.js. All you need to do is rename this also, right? Same thing with app.view. You can rename it to anything. Just you need to ensure that you are importing the proper file and you are creating the proper app. So as such, Vue does not force you to use the same folder names, but then there is a convention to it. For example, it is better to have components named as components because it will be easier to actually uh, involve other people in the project and to give creatives to them, right? So there is a convention around it. It is not mandatory that you stick to it, but obviously it is encouraged that being junior developers or being freshers, it is always better you stick to the convention because that will allow you to get to know the tech in a much better fashion, right? Also, the docs will actually stick to convention itself. So much more easier for you to understand where and what is happening, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to just remove all of this. I don't require this. So to start with, since this is not our use case, obviously, so I'll just remove all of this and I'll, for now, I'm just going to have a hello world. Simply remove this entire folder and also remove these two files. I don't require them. As for the main CSS, this. I'm just keeping the style CSS file because I may be using it later. So yeah. So what we have here is, and the CSS is being imported, Vue app is being created using the create app. So a lot of places you will also see something like this, which you will actually eventually end up doing yourself also. Because this app instance is used a lot with when adding plugins and when adding components, global level components and everything. So eventually you will end up doing this. So what happens is basically I'm creating the app and I'm using that app instance to actually mount the Vue app in a particular markup, in a particular HTML, right? Yeah. So right now, what I have is a simple hello world, which is from this particular place. Now, in Vue, the basic syntax is split into three different parts. One is template, one is script, and one is style tag. Okay. The template tag is where all your markup goes in, right? So whatever HTML you write, that goes inside. Style tag is where you write CSS for this particular component. By default, the style tag is global. So whatever styles that you write here can affect other components also, right? There is a way to have scope styling. We'll come to. So right now, what I'm going to do is I'll have, for a simple use case, I'll have an input, say, let's create a division. Uh, let's say I have a label for me. Input, which is also going to be basically, uh, since I want to give a bit of styling, what I'll do is I want to give it a bit of margin, obviously. So what I'll do is I'll give it, say, MR4. Now this MR4 is something which comes from Bootstrap or Tailwind. It's simple utility classes that are available in Bootstrap Tailwind. I'm not using any Bootstrap or Tailwind right now. Feel free to use it. In fact, if needed, we'll see how we can add Bootstrap and Tailwind, how we can add Tailwind to the project itself. Right now, we'll focus on basic stylings, right? Now what I want to do is I'll create this class wherein margin right is going to be, say, um, so yeah. And what I'll do is give this a class called as next4. Sorry. Uh, just like what happened right now, a lot of times the UI does not get refreshed. Don't depend on hot reload that much. Just refresh and you will actually see change. Right? So what I have here is I have a simple label, I have a simple text field, and I have hello world. What I would want is basically whenever I type some name in text field, say Param, it should show hello Param or whatever, right? So whatever I type, it should show that particular name there. So what I'll do is now there are two types of APIs that you can use with Vue. One is something called as options API, and one is something called as composition API. Composition API was introduced with Vue 3. What I'm going to do is I'm first going to introduce you to options API, and then we will change that to composition API. Mainly because a lot of resources that you see out there is actually going to be in in options API, but composition API is the newer format in the Vue docs. The Vue team also encourages you to actually write in composition API, and they basically created a whole different structure out of it. And composition API is something in the lines of hooks, React hooks, if you have done React. So it is much more powerful and much more easier to organize code in composition API as compared to options. But since a lot of resources out there is going to be in options API, I'll show you both the API formats so that it is easier for you guys to actually get started with this. So what happens in options API is basically you have an object which is exported in the script tag. So if you have chosen TypeScript, all you need to do is just simply type lang ts and it will actually start using TypeScript. Right now, I'm not using TypeScript. I'm sticking to JavaScript. So else I'm not using that. Right. Now, in this object, there are multiple lifecycle methods. And at the same time, there are multiple different methods that will be used every now and then when you're working with a Vue project. One such method is actually the data property, which is what we are going to use right now. Now, this data function actually has to return an object which will have all the attributes for this particular component, and which is what can be used in the entire component. Always remember the data attribute is actually localized to a component. There are ways to pass data attributes to child components called as props. We'll come to that. But then data attributes are always supposed to be used inside the component. If you're trying to use data outside somewhere by some other means, please don't do it. It's not the right way. So what I'll do is I have, say, suppose name, and by default it is going to be null, right? Now, what we want is whenever we type something in this particular input, that has to go inside this name field, and that has to be displayed here, right? Traditionally, what you would do is you would create a on change listener to this input. You will add methods to it, and that method will simply change this. Why not? Why don't we do it simple? Uh, so in order for us to add methods, we have method key. Say suppose on change. Now, this is not the Vue way to do it. This is the traditional way to do it. I'll also show you the Vue way. And what I want to show you guys is how you would actually be handling it in just native JavaScript and how actually Vue helps you do that. Right. So what I'll do is and we'll have on change. Now in this on change, I have to actually pass this method. In order for me to use any methods, view methods inside here, what I have to do is use something called as be on directive. So this thing is something what we call as a directive. There are multiple different directives that we'll actually get into. Beyond is one such. What Beyond does is whenever this particular event is fired, what it needs to do is it needs to call this function. That is what a Beyond you simply does. There is a shorthand to it. You can simply write at on change. Right. So when you're writing JavaScript, you would be writing on change. When you're writing beyond directive or event emitters, it is simply just at change, right? So what I'm doing is at change, I'm calling this function. I'll take event here. And for now, I'll simply just console log right now. And console log. Sorry, there are a lot of windows to keep track of, but yeah, this is what development is. So so whenever I type something here, yeah. So whenever I'm typing something here, as soon as I'm done with it, basically is right now printing it. It is printing just the text because that is what I have written. So I'm specifically choosing the value of this particular text field. If I just choose the event, it will print the entire object of that event. Right? See. Now this event is simply a wrapper of the on-change event that is emitted by JavaScript itself, right? This is nothing different per se. It's the same thing. So what I can do is I can access this name here. So this dot name equal to event dot get dot value. For me to use this name inside the template of any component. So for using any data property inside the template, or for that matter, any data property or any methods inside the template. For methods, you can simply use the on on change property and use it as a variable. If you are calling the method to actually get some kind of text, which you should not per se. But if you are doing that, what you need to do is use double curly braces. So what this text, the funda is basically text interpolation. What it basically says is whatever I'm writing inside here is basically something from the script part of the Vue component, right? So if I say name, yeah. So when I actually put name here, by default, this entire thing is gone right now because it is null. So default value is null. If I say type something, for example, Alex, see. Now, what is happening is whenever I'm actually changing, after the change, this particular function is getting invoked. This function is setting the value inside the text field into the name property, and that is being accessed here, right? This is what reactivity is all about. Whenever I'm actually changing this value, automatically the UI changes. I am not doing anything specifically to change the UI. The view is smart enough to look at and see ki, okay, this particular variable is used here. This variable is being changed here. So I should go back and re-render the UI and show the newer value there, right? This is what reactivity is. So whenever I change this name, it automatically changes here. If I say, suppose use at input instead of on change, what you will notice is whenever I actually type anything, it is rendering every time I actually type any kind of word, right? So this is basically the input event of the text input. Change event fires only after you have actually lost the focus, right? This entire thing is handled in a very simple format in Vue using something called as a V model, right? All I need to do is simply use V model directive and pass the data attribute that I have created inside the V model. You can just get rid of this function. And what Vue now does is it says that, okay, this is a particular text field. Whenever whenever the text field changes, it puts that value inside the name property. And since the name value of the name property changes, this markup gets rendered automatically, right? So for example, right? So the output is same, but because of V model, we don't actually have to handle the events manually. V model is handling the input event automatically. We don't need to do that. So this is how you can actually create form of 10 different fields and actually link the variables to each input so that you can actually get the value out of those input whenever you want. Right? This is what we will do very soon. Right? And ultimately, you are basically linking this variable to this field, this input, and simply displaying it here. This concept is what we call as two-way data binding, right? So whenever I actually end up changing this name, say for example, I have, uh, let's say I have a button here, name, and on click of that particular button, what I'm supposed to do is change the name directly, right? To some random value. So I'll create this. So the actual syntax for writing methods or even for writing data is basically methods is the key which has the object. And there you have the method name as the key and you have a function for it, right? It could be an arrow function or it could be a function defined using the function keyword. When I do this, I am actually effectively, when I do this, I'm effectively doing the same thing. This is just the shorthand format of that thing. So I'm actually just creating a property inside change name, property named as change name, which is going to be a method, right? So what I'll do is I'll say, suppose I have an array of names here, right? Say it is going to be and I'll goes count of 0. This.com. So what I'm doing is basically just a simple logic where I'm going to pick any name from here in a simple order, and I'll just set it to this dot name. Say right now, say suppose here I have uh, say Richa, and if I click this, right now it shows Alex, right? Now when I actually click this button, this field is being set. This this dot name is being set, which obviously changes the UI, but it not just changes the UI, but it also changes the text inside the input field, right? So this is what two-way data binding is called, right? So it is not just taking the input from the text field, but it also has the ability to set that input into the text field, right? This is very useful when you want to pre-fill a form with the values that you're getting from the API and basically allow users to edit it, right? So this is the main use case for it. Yeah. So I think till now, if someone has some queries, just feel free to put something and maybe I can give a minute to that solving that out. So mainly with regards to whatever has happened till now, right? Not in general. Fair enough. Yeah. So we have data, we have methods, right? So what I was the use case that we planned was basically an expense tracker. What we will do is we will have maybe say add expense here, which basically shows the expense, a form which has the expense name, the cost, and we add it into a list, and that basically displays the expenses, right? So what we can do is say what I'll do for now is just simply remove this entire thing. We actually require the data on the display. Tracker, we have add expense button to this. The list will be created. Right now, we will create the list inside the component itself. So everything is localized. Since we don't have a backend, everything will be localized right now. So inside the JavaScript itself. So yeah, what we will do is we will have a button here, say add expense. We'll have put this inside application. Mhm. For this, what I'll have is, let's just have a maybe a table which has description. So, yeah, that's an interesting question in the Zoom chat here. Basically, Mayank Gupta is asking, can we connect Vue to the database like MySQL? Now, the point to remember is Vue is a front-end technology. It runs inside the browser. The browsers natively do not actually allow you to connect to uh, an operating system port directly. And traditionally, you are not supposed to connect front end to your database directly. So, per se, you should not actually connect with MySQL databases directly. You are supposed to create APIs and connect via API via a backend. There are database as a service like Supabase and other packages like Firebase and all, which actually allows you to connect to database. It is not a flaw. It is by design. Even React cannot connect to MySQL directly. You should not connect. If you are creating a desktop app, you might very well create you have the packages inbuilt, and that in that case you are okay to connect again, but you should not connect it. That is what the software design habits are, right? I hope I answered your question. So let's say we have description and price, and then yeah. So this is where each of our uh, expenses going to come. Say for now, if I'm saying, so petrol was one of my expense, which costed me like 1,200. So just 200. Then it is movie and say workshop. Fund, right? So this is our basic our expense. This is going to look. Obviously, you can make it a lot better UI. That is the purpose of this. Some. What I'll do is I'll put this inside the T head tab. Now, so whenever we add an expense, what is going to happen is it is going to add in a particular array or list in JavaScript, and then it is going to get displayed here. So for that, first we actually need a list which will uh, be displayed in this particular table, right? So let's say we have the data property and return. Now, unlike other properties, when you are using options API, the structure is basically options API. Uh, Unlike methods and in fact computed and watcher, which we'll come to, uh, unlike that, data is the only property which is a method in itself. If you remember, methods was actually an object which has JavaScript functions in it, but data is basically a function in itself. right? So data is a function which is returning an object. A lot of places you will see a syntax like something like this. This is the same thing. This is basically an arrow function which is returning an object, right? This is the same thing, just the way of writing is different. This does not look good, right? Again, everyone has different opinions of it. Some people prefer writing it like this. I usually prefer writing it explicitly as a function and having a return statement. So whatever suits for you, it's good. No problem. So we will have an array and say we are going to have a name for the expense, and then we are going to have the price for it. This was good. Movie. And this was workshop. Right? Now, what we need to do is basically use this array to make this entire uh, low rows dynamic, right? So what you will do is I'm first going to get rid of the 4 different rows here. What I'm going to use is something called as a v-for directive, right? So what v-for does is basically it's a for loop over an array. It loops around that array and iterates and displays that many number of markup that you have actually written here, right? So I'm going to do expense in expense in expenses. So this is the key that I'm using. So expenses, and this is what I'm going to name for one single element. It can be anything. This is just simply an element, right? Element inside the expenses array. Just to have a better naming, I'm using it as expense, right? So inside the expense object, I have name and I have name and price. As soon as I do this, we have the same UI, but now what it is actually doing is rendering from this particular list. So if I change the order, you can see this order has actually changed here, right? So we have a table which has rows mapped to this particular array. It is iterating over this array and displaying the data from that particular array. This is how you can do this. The concept is called as list rendering, wherein you are actually rendering a list of any type. It, right now, this is an object, a list of objects. It can be simple string, it can be numbers, can be anything. And you are basically repeating this particular markup for all the elements of this particular list, right? So that is the main logic behind this entire thing. So what we have here is, uh, let's give this a bit of maybe a photo. Looks ugly, but yeah, not doing anything. This call spacing and all of this is actually pretty old attributes. Again, this is not a UI session, so I'm not more focused on UI. So we have a basic UI which displays all of this, uh, and we have it in a dynamic array here. What we want to do is have a form which will take the description and the price, add it, and display it inside the table, right? So for that, what I'm going to do is have a form tag action. Don't also require a form tag, but yeah. Description. Good. What I have is basic. Sorry. Yeah. Likewise, this two things here. Set it off. And then obviously you need a button. Add. Yeah, we will show the top total expense in the end. Just give me one. Off. Uh, so yeah, this is the base UI that I want, which has two text fields, one for description, one for placeholder, and we have an add button here, right? Now, since we are doing this, what is happening here is my view part, the part which is actually pertaining to viewing my expense, and the part which is pertaining to adding my expense are both getting mixed inside the same file. Ideally, this should not be the case. What you should actually do is isolate the features as much as possible so that it becomes easier to debug. What I'll do is I'll create a folder, components. I'll have a view expenses.view file. Template tag here, and I'll take this entire table inside this. Now this actually requires the expenses here. I'll come to that in a moment. Likewise, I'll create a file for add expense. Again, have a template. Take this entire form, put this here. what I'll do right now is, so what I want to do first is I want to actually have that component, the add expense component inside this UI, right? For that, what I can do is first I need to import that, which is, since I am in the app components and add expense. Since I want to use this component inside the markup, inside the template, I first need to tell Vue that this is a component and you have to pick it up from here. Like for, if I go on to add this component here, what will happen is it is actually going to give me an error saying that it failed to resolve the add expense component, because as far as Vue is concerned, it does not know where that component is, right? What I need to do is I need to tell Vue that there is a add expense component specifically. Okay. So once I do this, so this is essentially specifically doing this thing, okay, wherein you have a key, which is what the component is actually going to be named inside the tag, and we have the actual component markup, or rather the component JavaScript here, the component file that we imported. So we are basically telling that whenever you get this particular tag, you have to render this particular component. Say, for example, if I just write add here, so this will again throw me an error saying ki there is no component called as add. What I have to do then is tell Vue that if I have some tag called as add, it actually refers to the add expense component, right? Most of the times, the component name, the file name, and the component tag that you will use would be same. And in those cases, you actually don't require to write specifically key and value. You can use the JavaScript shorthand to just simply write it in a single line and it will resolve it for you. Right? You don't need to specifically write this. So once I do this and so I refresh, I have this form here. Now this form is basically a different component altogether, right? And we have a different component for expenses. Whenever we add something, it should actually add to that particular array. And whenever it gets added, we should be able to view it here, which basically means that our array should be in some place which is common to both of them. It cannot be in add expense because then view expense cannot access it. And it cannot be in view expense because add cannot access it, right? So this is where the concept of props comes into picture. What we can do is we can keep this array inside the parent, which is app.view in this case, and we can pass it to view as a prop. So firstly, what I'll do is I'll actually declare view expense here, and I'll replace this entire table with view expense. As soon as I do that, obviously it is going to throw me an error, which is saying that add expenses. Okay, expenses. Even then, it is going to form an error. Yeah. So if you see, it basically says that a property named as expenses was accessed, but it is not defined, right? So if you see the view expenses file, we have this expenses key here, which is actually not defined inside the view expenses. What we should be doing is, let's have this script tag for default props. And here we'll have a prop called as expenses, which is going to be an array, right? Now, what I need to do is I need to pass this expenses array. Now, if I write something like this, it is basically a property which has a string value expenses, right? That is not what we want to do here. What we want to do is basically we want to have this array sent here. So to do that, we have a directive called as vbind, wherein we are saying that this particular property is bound to a data property named as expenses, right? So you can use this vbind attribute to actually connect the template with some property which has to be dynamically sent from the script, right? The shorthand for vbind is simply using colon. You don't need to actually write the entire vbind every time. You can simply use colon and the property name. What it is doing now is sending this expenses array inside this property, right? And once that is done, you can see our UI is actually able to render the expenses array now because it is being sent as a property to view expenses from app.view, right? Now what we need to do is we need to add an expense here, right? For that, again, we'll have a script default. I'll have a data attribute return. Now what I have is going to be just simply an expense object. Whenever you're working with proper projects, backends, a lot of time you have a single entity which has multiple attributes. In such cases, you don't actually require multiple attributes to be declared here. You can just simply declare one object and you can simply tell expense dot description. I'll match the key here. Sorry, expense dot name. Right? And when I press this button on it, not on to variables, and nothing, expense. Now, what we need to do is essentially, say for example, first I'll have a console log here just to show you guys. Expense. Let's say rep add has to be this dot expense. When I say just expense, it is actually going to search here, which is not the case. We don't have a variable here. We have to access the variable from the data property, hence this dot expense. Also, when I actually click this, what is happening is the page is getting reloaded, which is not what we want. So what I'll do is I'll stop the propagation, or rather I can use prevent, which will actually just simply prevent the default behavior, right? So if I do this now, what I see is a blank object. I'll say add. So we have an object which has name, which has the property name as strip and price set to 5,000, right? This thing is called as a modifier, right? So basically this is nothing but uh, effectively doing this, right? So for this, you will have to take the event as a parameter here and then do prevent default. A lot of times we use prevent default and stop propagation. We can simply use this modifier here to actually achieve that result, right? So once the expense is added, we have to somehow actually send data from the child to the parent. Now, using props, you can send data from parent to child, but you cannot send data from child to parent. It is basically inheritance. Your father's property comes to you, does not go the other way around by default, right? So the same way, the parent's property, the parent's data attribute can go to child, but the child's attributes cannot go to the parent directly. So for that, what we do is we can achieve that in two ways. We can either have a callback and send that call the function using the callback which is sent through props, or we can emit a custom event and handle it in the parent. So how we can do that is basically use a function called as $emit. We can say add, the event name is add expense, and the data that is going to be sent is this object, right? Once we do this, right, what we have to do is essentially come to this is and handle that event. So here, what I'll do is I'll add expense and call a function called as add expense, right? Now, this add expense is basically going to be a method data, and for now I'll simply just console log the data so that we can have a look, right? Once that is done, so say trip 5,000 add and see. Now this is being printed in the app.vue file in this particular line. So it actually says you exactly app.vue colon 46. This 46 is basically the line number from where this log is printed, right? So this is 46 line number, right? So what it does is as soon as you click add, the add expense is emitting this event and sending the data. The parent component is listening to that event. Whenever that event is fired, this listener is invoked, right? So this is the main way wherein you can handle this. Events and props together allow you to actually send and receive data uh, to and fro in a very simple way. V model, which I said during the input thing, basically uses events and props together to achieve two-way data binding, right? So V model is nothing but an abstraction over events, emitting events, and handling props, right? So what I'll do is I'll add this, say, new expense data, and I'll add this to this dot expenses dot push data. Save. Reduce this a bit so that we can see. Trip 5,000. Add. Finish. Trip 5,000. Add. See, this gets added dynamically. What is happening here is we are adding an expense. Once we click on the add button, the add expense event is called. The add expense triggers this handler, which adds the data to this array, right? And since this array is sent to view expense as a prop, automatically the view expense UI is also re-rendered, and we are able to see this data here directly, right? So here, when I actually send the expense, you can see the price is actually an integer. Sorry, it's actually a string. That is not what we want. Actually, we should be having it as a number. So what I can do is I can add a modifier to be model or dot number. And if I now select this, say you can see this is actually now a number. It is not a string. So when you add this dot number modifier to v model, it automatically takes whenever it takes the value, it converts it into a number and then sends you that as a number directly. So you don't have to actually manually parse it. Right. Now what I want to achieve first is I want to show you guys composition API. So what we wrote here, this entire thing is something called as options API, as I've said. In composition API, we actually don't need to write this things in a separate, different manner. What we do is we have a single setup function, right? And whatever setup function actually returns becomes the attributes for the UI, right? So for example, now the main thing to remember is in the same project, composition API and options API can exist. That is not an issue. But one particular component has to be either in composition or in options. You cannot write both of them in the same file. You can have different files, one in composition and one in options API. That is okay, but you cannot have it in the same file, right? So if I'm writing the setup, I should not have this. So what I'll do is I'll do this. Now, expenses. Sorry, expenses. Now, in terms of in case of composition API, for us to use for us to declare data properties, we have something called as ref or reactive, both of which can be used, right? Reactive works only with complex data types, that is an object on an array, whereas ref works with everything. Whenever you are using ref, in order for you to access the value, you have to use specifically dot value attribute. I'll stick to ref right now. So what I need to do is I'll create a ref. I'll put this as the default value inside it, right? For methods, all you need to do is simply just declare the method as a arrow function. You don't need to do anything extra. So I'll just copy this, paste. This is the input function which is going to receive this thing. Now, For me to access this expenses and add to it, I can't do this dot expenses. What I'll have to do is this dot value dot expense, the value dot push, and this basically removes this entire thing. Now, if I just refresh this, sorry, what I need to do in the end is actually return whatever I am going to use in the template, right? So if I just do this, I have this entire thing. I can add things to it. All of this works same, no difference. But now your code of same feature has actually come together. You don't have to, your code is not split into different parts, but rather it is actually in the same function, which is close to each other. One more extension of composition API is to simply type script setup. What it does is basically compiles everything which is inside the script setup, puts it in the setup function automatically. So you don't actually need to define components separately. You can just simply import it and it will directly return it. And you just need to define whatever you are going to use. So this script setup syntax is a very useful syntax when you actually know that all of the things that you're going to write inside the template is inside the script is actually going to be used inside template. So my 20, 25 lines of code has now actually gotten reduced to pretty less, right? So this script setup is used only and only in case of composition API, not in case of options API. Whenever you are writing script setup, you are writing composition API, not options. Always remember that, right? So this is the composition API. We have composition API in app.vue. We are using options in Vue also. As I said, you mix composition API and options API in the same project, but you can mix them in the same. That I want to do here and what I want to show you guys is in the I want to actually show a total sort of thing, right? So maybe okay. Let's make this. So what I want to do is basically add all of them and show the total expense. Don't have, what I'll do is, so expense. Obviously you can use the reduce method, not an issue. Uh, stop expenses. Since I'm using the uh, options API, I need to use this dot expenses. If I was using composition API, I would have used simply expenses dot value, right? Or rather in case of props dot expenses. For each to take. Ultimately, I'm going to return total expense here. Here, all I need to do is. So now if you see what it does is basically iterate through this array, create and returns me a value, and I am using this as a normal data property. I am not actually invoking this as a function. This is being used as a data property. What this essentially does is whenever I actually do this, it automatically changes and calls the computed field and updates the value. If I change something which is not used inside the computed property, it won't actually re-render this, call this function again and re-render the UI. Vue is smart enough to actually look into the function and see which properties are being used inside. And if they change, only then the computed property is invoked. If they don't change, the computed property is not invoked, even if the props change. Right? Even if other uh, values might change, but still the computed property function is not invoked. And hence that particular UI is also not re-rendered. Right? So this computed field is actually used a lot in Vue projects. They are a very powerful tool. You should not actually call methods. So in this case, I could have simply just used a method and called a method, but then that would calling this method. Vue would actually calling this every time it wants to read, because obviously it can't keep track of what properties are used inside of it, and automatically chooses to re-render only if the properties change. Right. So this is the base of Vue. I showed you the options API, showed you the composition API. I showed you how you can mix it. I showed you how you can emit events, how you can handle events, how you can handle events, how you can send data from parent to child as a prop, and also get data from child to parent as an event. One main thing, if you want to simply, if at all you want, there is a place wherein you want to show something conditionally, you can use something called as VIF, which is called as conditional rendering. Show form. What I'll do is I have ref default will be false. So if it is false, don't show it, does not show it. And if I click on add expense, show form, and at the same, as soon as the expense is added, evaluate. So refresh, click on see form. As soon as I click on add, the expense gets added and the form disappears. This is called as conditional rendering. There is if, which can directive which can be used for this conditional rendering. Right? So I hope I have covered the basics of it. I have covered conditional rendering, list rendering, event handling, two-way data binding, which is form handling, and also state and props. If you have any, feel free to ask.
Thank you. So I would like to request everyone, guys, if you have any question, kindly write it down in a Q&A tab. And I'm launching a session feedback form. Kindly do fill out that as well. So we have few questions. Let's start with the first one. Just give me. So Pavitra is asking, is Vue is better than React?
Vikram, are you there? Am I?
No, your voice is breaking actually.
Hello?
Yeah, now audible.
Yeah.
Am I audible to you, right? Am I audible to you? I think he's facing some network issues, guys. Please wait for a moment. Your mic is with, yeah,
Hello?
yeah,
Am I audible now?
yeah.
Yeah.
So actually, our first question is Pavitra is asking, is that Vue is better than React?
So, it's not necessarily that Vue is better than React or React is better than Vue. Both have their own use case. React is a project which is backed by a company, is in this case Meta. Vue is a mainly community-driven project backed by the official group. They both have their use case, and it depends on personal choices of which to use.
Okay. So our next question, Kiran is asking, I am new to Vue.js. What's the best way to start? Should I learn Vue 2 first or directly jump to Vue 3?
Uh, Vue 3 definitely, because Vue 2 is deprecated. It has reached its end of life. There is no more support for it. And anything that you learn in Vue 3 will actually kind of be backward portable to Vue 2 also. Options API is a Vue 2's part, and it is per se the same thing here. Vue 3 has composition API, which is the addition. So Vue 3 by default.
Okay. Like if you want, you can stop sharing your screen as well.
Oh yeah.
Thank you.
Think it stopped.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
So next question is, I have heard about Vuex and Pinia for managing state. As a beginner, when should I start learning them? And do I always need them?
No, you do not always need them. VueX is the part of Vue 2. Pinia is the part of Vue 3. If you are using Vue 3, it will be Pinia, and you do not always need them. They will be useful only in higher end use cases. Generally, you will be okay with state props and composition API.
Okay, so next question is, I want to get a job as a Vue.js developer. What skills apart from Vue itself should I focus on?
Mainly CSS, because Vue.js, as I said, is a front-end technology. CSS is the part of it. The main thing that you need to focus on is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Vue is the cherry on top of JavaScript.
Okay. So Prajwal is asking, Vue doesn't have any hooks?
It does. Composition API is basically Vue hooks.
Okay.
So you don't require use state or use effect. Use effect is essentially computed. Use state is basically the setup function, ref and reactive, whatever we are using is use state. You don't require it specifically.
Sanket is asking, can we, actually he is written great, so I think he's saying create. Can we create interactive speedy website with Vue.js as front end and Laravel as backend together?
Yes, we can. Laravel and Vue are used a lot together. Uh, Ultimately, remember that Vue is a front-end tech. It does not depend on what tech backend is using. As far as there is some way to connect them, like for example, a REST API or a socket, you can use Vue with anything. Doesn't matter.
Okay. So same Sarfraz is also asking, can we use Laravel for backend with Vue?
So yeah, we can use, as I said, irrespective of backend tech, backend can be in Laravel or Go or Node or Python. It can be in anything, does not matter. Front-end techs do not actually depend on backend tech. What they depend on is there a way to connect them? So if, as far as you have a REST API or some sort of API, a socket or anything, you are good to go.
So Pavitra is asking, in React, they provide JSON server to store data. Is that Vue also provide JSON server?
So it is not JSON server, if I'm not wrong, in React. What they are essentially saying is the local storage. Local storage is actually a part of Web API. So irrespective of whichever framework you use, you can always access Web API and Web APIs. So local storage and session storages are always available.
So Anurag is asking, can we use Vue.js to develop mobile application?
Yes, you can actually. Not directly. Just like React has React Native, Vue is used in something called as native script. So Vue can actually be used for mobile development also. But then there are better alternatives for that definitely. Flutter, and there are other frameworks too.
So next question, are there any good open source Vue.js projects where beginner can contribute and gain experience?
Yeah, there are many Vue templates that you can see in GitHub. You can actually contribute to it and gain experience. Definitely.
So our second last question, as a front-end Vue.js developer, do I also need backend skill to get a job?
Backend,
As a front-end Vue.js developer, do I also need backend skills to get a job?
not essentially. So as far as front end is concerned, irrespective of whatever tech you use, be it Angular or React or Vue, you do not per se require backend experience to get a front end job. But then ultimately, what we need to remember is backend and front end, all of them come together to actually create an app. So it is always better to have some idea of how the backend works so that it actually makes your life much more easier.
Okay. So here we are done with all the questions as well. So like is there anything which you want to convey to the audience who are watching you right now or who will watch after some time?
Uh, the only thing that I would want to convey is, irrespective of whatever tech you use, be it React or be it Vue, I would urge you to focus on the concept on which that tech works, because concept is what is going to be consistently same irrespective of what framework you use. once you understand the concept, understanding the tech on it and understanding different frameworks is actually not that big of a deal.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much,
Thank
Parameswaran, for
you. Sure.
taking this session. And a huge thank to like everyone who have joined us today. We really appreciate your time. And one thing which I want to tell that the session recording will be available on Shine.com's YouTube channel and LinkedIn. So feel free to revisit the session anytime. And if anyone have any question, kindly reach out to us or directly message Parameswaran for further guidance. So stay connected, keep learning, and we look forward to see you in our future masterclasses. Till then, bye bye, everyone, and thank you so much, Pravishran, once again. Thank you. People are writing message for you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks
Okay.
everyone for coming
Thank,
in and joining in. I hope this was helpful.
thank you. Bye bye. Take care.